has to do with bulbar polio. And so I was hoping you could share that story of adaptation. I think this is just such a remarkable story. So I'll let you take that over.
Well, that probably is one of the most significant crises I could have had in the Korean War in the 1951, 52, 53. I was sent to the Philippines by the U.S. Air Force at Clark Air Force Base, 80 miles north of Manila in the Philippines. Prior to that, I had spending a year and a half at Peter Brigham Hospital at Harvard in Boston, a year and a half of pathology. That pathology is autopsy work, surgical specimens, and all of that, because it's a good background no matter what field you go into. But that was cut short. The Korean War started in the last week in June of 1950. So 6 months later, Air Force activated me, sent me to the Philippines. And there, something happened that changed my life forever. I did back then general medicine, some orthopedic work, but then we developed the largest epidemic of bulbar polio of any American armed force base in the world. Now, bulbar polio, it hits the lower centers of your brain down below, and you lose the ability to breathe. And if you can't breathe, you can't live. So that's why the iron lung was developed years ago. They call it the respirator now. And the respirator will breathe for you long enough for you to get over it. And usually there are no sequelae, no leftovers if you survive. But you've got to have respirator to survive. Okay. The other is peripheral polio. You may survive easily, but you have a paralyzed arm or leg. What happened then, our epidemic there was so bad that every night people were coming in and they were dying. We only had one respirator at the base, and we had to put them in line. And the ones that couldn't live long enough without the respirator, they died. So then the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology said, have your pathology do autopsies on all the patients die of this bulbar polio. And they said, well, we only have one fellow, but he's not a pathologist. He had a year and a half of pathology up there at Harvard. Find out who he trained under. Okay. And the colonel of the hospital, they want to know where you train and who. I tell them it's Walbach up there at Boston. And they said, he's okay. He's one of the best in the nation. Doesn't matter. If he has done autopsies under this guy, he can handle the autopsies here. Yeah. Well, that was a big jump. I had to then autopsy the patients in the jungle, a makeshift morgue, and have a Filipino helping me because the Filipinos have a ethnic resistance to polio. I didn't know that. Okay. But he helped me. Night after night, we would have to cut out, do an autopsy. It's a hell of a conversation, but cut out the spinal cord and sometimes the brain and ship it out to the Armed Forces Pathology. They were trying to make a vaccine then for polio. But then all the other doctors in the hospital realized, even though I was taking precaution, cap, gas, nap, gap, the whole bit, protection, gloves, I was going to be infected. And they were afraid to be around me. They knew I was going to develop bulbar polio. Yeah. And so I had to be alone. And they say, we love you like a brother, but we got to stay away from you. 10 days later, I developed a sore throat. I developed a headache, a stiff neck, and then I knew I was beginning stages of bulbar polio. One of my doctors examined me and said, Reese, you're developing bulbar polio. I said, I know. I said, just keep in mind that don't give me preferential treatment to the respirator. Keep it in line with the others ahead of me. That's it. And I thought really that was the end of my life. But then a funny thing happened. As time went on, 10 days later, my fever went away, my stiff neck went away, and my friend, the doctor, said, Reese, you're getting better. But why are you getting better? And all the others are dying. I said, I'm not sure. He said, there's something. I said, but be happy for me. He said, I'm happy for it, but medically, I don't get it. Have you ever been in contact with bulbar polio before? I said, yeah, 4 years ago. We had the biggest epidemic in Memphis, my senior year of medical school. And we had to stay and take care of these young people, teenagers, young people, and kept gown and mask, but still we were with them hours and hours. He said that your immune system picked up enough immunity from those young teenagers in that time in the epidemic in 1947 in the city of Memphis Hospital. That has saved your life here a year later in the Philippines, because that has enabled you to overcome the virus because you're getting better. And I got to thinking, my God, I had no idea that all the bedtime stories I told to these children in the hospital who were dying of Bulbar Polio, because we only had one respirator, I didn't realize they were giving me immunity through my immune system by a little dose at a time, a little dose at a time. And that saved my life when I had to do autopsies on all these patients in 1952, 53 at Clark Air Force Base years later. What are the chances of that happening?
Incredible connection besides the adaptation. It's a physical adaptation as well. It's just amazing. And I'm sure they were all, first of all, it was incredulous to them, I'm sure. And then they were just amazed by it.
But as I say, you just never know what will come from something. And I felt like the kids wanted me to come over and tell them bedtime stories. And I just said, well, this is something that I should do. And I did it. But I didn't realize that was going to save my life. 4 years later in the jungle of the Philippines doing autopsies on these patients that died. It's amazing.
It's so
just
amazing.
amazing.